Are scraps taking over your sewing room? Are you tired of man-hauling your quilt sandwich through your sewing machine? Are you looking for a fast and easy project? In this quilting tutorial, we are diving into the Quilt-As-You-Go method to make some beautiful quilts using our scraps with my top tips and tricks. And stay to the end where I will be sharing some bonus layouts. So stick with me and I'll show you how to do it. Hi, I'm Karen Brown of Just Get It Done Quilts. I give you tips, tricks, and strategies to help you make the quilt that you want to make. And if you like what you see, please hit that subscribe button. Quilt-As-You-Go technique has been around for a long time. It is sometimes called the pot holder method or the portable method because you make your quilt sandwich at the block level and then you sew them together into rows and then you sew the rows together to make a quilt. It allows you to use up the batting scraps that appear with every quilt you make. It utilizes your domestic sewing machine as you work one block at a time, so there's no need for bigger equipment. It also makes the handling of the bulk of the quilt easier, eliminating the aches and pains of handling a big quilt sandwich. There are many different methods for Quilt-As-You-Go, and this is just the first in a series. Today we're using the binding strip method with some scrappy strip blocks. I like this method a lot because it gives a nice clean finish on the back of the block. And I especially love that you can use all different types of scraps that accumulate from other projects, meaning your scraps are flowing out of your sewing room and into quilts. Now, before we do anything with our scraps, we need to know what size of block we're going to make. And this is my first top tip, and you want to choose a size that can do two things. It can fit easily underneath the harp of your sewing machine, and you actually have a ruler in that size. And I use two. I use this 9.5-inch ruler and I use this 6 by 12 inch. When you make your block quilt sandwiches, you will need your backing and your batting to be 1/2 inch to 1 inch larger than your finished size. For your back, you can choose all the same fabrics or a variety of fabrics. Your choice. And I find this is the perfect place to use up the cutoffs of wide backing. Or you can use yardage that's just hiding in the back of your closet. And then you need some batting squares. And it's important that you only use one type of batting per project, as batting shrinks at different rates. For the top, you need fabric strips. They don't need to be scraps. This is a perfect place for those long, narrow cutoffs. Now, I have shown you previously how I process my fabric scraps in this video here. And I showed you how I process my batting scraps in this video here. And now you can see the method in my madness. Out of my bigger fabric scraps, I make 10-inch squares that I can use for my backing in my Quilt-As-You-Go blocks. And I keep all my fabric strips less than 2.5 inches here that I can use in my tops. My batting squares I keep here, and they're separate by type. These are 100% cotton and these ones are 80/20. In this method, you sew fabric strips the length of the block. And each seam does double duty, not only sewing the strips together, but quilting all the layers together. And there are 4 basic types of blocks. For square blocks, you can have parallel lines or on a diagonal. And you can also use rectangles. Again, one with parallel lines and one on a diagonal. Which one you use is your personal taste. It is also your personal taste whether you let these lines be a little bit wonky or a lot, or you align them perfectly parallel to each other. There are many ways that you can play with color within these blocks. You can use 2 colors. You can make a rainbow, like from red to purple. You can play with the value, putting high on one side and low on the other. And any combination of these. But today, I'm going to keep it simple and just use one. First, you need to clean and oil your machine. Then set up your machine for quilting. So that means a longer stitch length. I like to use 2.5. You also need to change your needle to a quilting needle. And I like to use a larger size, like a 90. Then put on your walking foot or engage your differential foot if you have one. And in your bobbin, you want a thread color that works with your backing fabric. Next, pair up your backs and your batting to make some quilt sandwiches. Grab an assortment of your strips. Lay out the first strip, then place another strip beside it. Aim to have contrast between these two strips. So look for ones with a different pattern, with a different value, a different width, or a different color. Though mine are all going to be the same color, I make it a point to contrast at least two of these traits every time. Place your first strip right side up. Align the next strip right side down. Then sew a 1/4 inch seam down the side. Flip open, turn your work 180 degrees, and sew your next strip right side down on the other side of the first strip. By placing your work in the middle of your block, you can save yourself a trip to the iron. This is also a good place to use your seam roller. Then take another strip and align it to the right side, sew a 1/4 inch down the side, rotate and sew a strip along the other side. Then press. Continue to sew a strip to the side, rotate and sew a strip down the other side and press until the whole batting is covered. Do a final press with your iron. Trimming up should be nice and easy as we're trimming to the edge of the ruler, and any dangling threads or thread knots are trimmed off. This provides a nice clean finish to your block. Give them a good look over to be sure that all fabric is secured and threads are trimmed. For the diagonal block, the steps are the same. This one I'm using 45 degrees, which means it goes from corner to corner, but you can choose another angle if you prefer. And here's another tip. It's best to start with the longest piece in the center of the block. And when you add strips to each side, they get progressively smaller. Going the opposite way, from smaller to larger, can be a bit tricky knowing what size to choose. And often you can be short. Ask me how I know that mistake. So for making your blocks, I have a couple of tips. When I make these Quilt-As-You-Go blocks, I normally work with either 2 to 6 blocks at a time, mainly so I can balance my sewing time with my pressing time. If perfectly parallel strips is your goal, use the lines on your cutting mat. Place your strip sandwich aligned to the horizontal and vertical lines, then place your strip parallel to the grid. Here's another tip. Pay attention to the width of your final strips. You do not want a seam allowance within the last 1/4 inch of the edge of the finished block. And if you're using scraps, always be on the alert for tiny cuts in your fabric. Now it's really important that our blocks stay square, so keep them off to the side and try not to handle them. Our blocks are going to be held together with 1-inch fabric strips, giving your blocks a stained glass appearance. You can accentuate that look by using black or another low-value fabric, or you can choose to use a color that blends in. You can use all one color, or you can use several colors. You can use a solid fabric, you can use a stripe, or another pattern. This is also a good place to use up your leftover jelly roll strips and binding strips. You will need 2 1-inch strips for every seam. Before you start this step, change your thread to match your binding strips. One of the hallmarks of the Quilt-As-You-Go method is that you are only adding 1 block or 1 row at a time, which minimizes the bulk underneath your harp. And since you can assemble your quilt as you make the blocks, when you're done your last block, you're done with the quilt. All you need is a binding and a label. So we will start with the blocks on the far left of our quilt. Here are 2 blocks to be sewn together. Take 2 binding strips and the block on the left. Align these strips to the right raw edge, one on top, one on the bottom, with right sides together. If you'd like, you can hold them together with clips. Then sew a 1/4 inch seam through all the layers. Next, take the block on the right. Flip the block so that the left raw edge is on the right. With the wrong sides together, align the bottom strip to this side. Use clips to hold it together. Take a second to double check that the right block is oriented the way that you would like and that the top edges are even. Then sew a 1/4 inch seam. Depending on what foot you're using, you might need to hold the left seam out of the way. Press. Now the raw edges of your block should be tight together with no space in between. Turn the edge of the top strip under a scant 1/4 inch so that it just folds over the seam on the right. You can secure it with either pins or glue. Top stitch as close to the edge as possible. This seam will be visible on the top of the quilt, so that's why we changed our thread. Then repeat with the next block in the row. Continue until the row is complete. When you sew your rows together, you need to be sure that they butt up against each other with no space in between. And it's really easy for the blocks to get out of alignment, both on top or stretch out at the bottom. So before you sew your rows together, trim them straight. Sewing the rows together is exactly the same as sewing blocks together, except the seam is much longer. So you might need to sew 2 binding strips together to get the length. You might need to line up block strips from row to row. Now you're done, you just need a binding and a label. If you're like me and like to make all your blocks first, then sew them together, I have a couple of shortcuts. For the top binding strip, you can make your own double fold binding strip by using this little gizmo. Thread it through the device and with a hot iron pass the fabric through. That way you don't need to fuss to fold over that strip. And when I attach my binding to the next block, I change my stip to the blind hem. And in the bobbin, I use a specialty thread called Iron Infuse by Wonderfill. So when I lay my blocks on my ironing table, that fusible thread is on top. And I just need to press the binding strip over and it fuses in place. Changing the bobbin and the stitch every time is a little bit fussy. So I only use this method when I'm working many rows at a time. With the Quilt-As-You-Go method, you can just start with one block, or you can start with the final layout in mind. You can make all the blocks align or have them staggered. No need to make odd size blocks. Just cut an existing one and add it to the other end of the row.
One reason why I like to use my 6x12 block is because it gives me more layout options. I can have them all aligned, or I just need to turn one 90 degrees to have a layout that has so much more impact. And there's variations on this you can use.
How you arrange your fabrics can also have an impact on the layout. You can use up scrap half-square triangles in the corners. And when you start to combine color, placement, orientation, and size, you can see that there are so many ways that you can use your scraps for good.
And one of the biggest bonuses for a Quilt-As-You-Go layout is that you can always add another row, whether for a bigger bed or for a bigger person.
I hope you find a way to make this Quilt-As-You-Go technique work for your stash. And if you don't know, in October I will be heading to Honolulu to learn Hawaiian quilting with 2 third-generation Hawaiian quilters. Then together we will be visiting the other islands aboard Norwegian's Pride of America. It's a wonderful way to learn a new technique, meet new friends, and see all the beauty of Hawaii. If you would like to join us, click on the link on my website or in the notes below. Take care, and I'll see you next time.